Okay. Deception, cherry-picking intelligence, ignorance of history, fear tactics, and more make the parallels between Vietnam and Iraq and the Middle East quite striking. Last week we heard Khalidi on the DVD talking about the historical illiteracy in the Middle East. We don't need to add anything to what he said. Tonight I will talk about the historical illiteracy about Vietnam and then the misuse of the intelligence process in both Vietnam and the Middle East. So we'll start with the historical illiteracy in Vietnam, and we need to go back in history for a little bit. In fact, back to Thomas Jefferson. What's Thomas Jefferson got to do with Vietnam? As our first Secretary of State, it was Jefferson who established the policy of de facto recognition of governments. How do you deal, how do you relate to a government which has come to power by revolution, by whatever process? How do you decide whether or not to recognize it and when? Jefferson established a de facto policy. I can remember my political science professor in college saying again and again and again, recognition does not imply sanction. You're recognizing the reality, that's the government there, that's the government you have to deal with. It's not a question of whether you like it or dislike it, it's there. That policy continued until the Woodrow Wilson administration, all through U.S. history up until then. Now, I've always been somewhat of an admirer of Woodrow Wilson and his idealism. But there was a moral piety here that was very damaging to government, particularly in his Secretary of State, the Reverend William Jennings Bryan. They were struggling with revolutions in Latin America, and Bryan thought he could curb those resolutions by saying, you to overturn a South American country, by revolution, we won't recognize you. And he adopted a de jure policy, recognizing governments that he thought had a right to be in power, not in fact were in power. This is one of the worst foreign policy mistakes this country has ever made. That decision is a Pandora's box that has plagued us ever since. Consider what happens. You're operating by no principle but political expediency. If we like you, we'll recognize you. If we don't, we won't. Never mind how you came to power, never mind anything. Just, if you're on our side, fine. You're good, you may be evil, you may be immoral, you may do all of these things, but you're on our side. Look at the Iran-Contra. Look at what's happened again and again and again, where we uphold one revolutionary trying to turn out Allende, for example, or Juan Bosch, because we don't like them, and on the other hand, uphold political tyrants, because we do. Look at Saddam Hussein. We upheld him for a number of years. Then we decided we had to overturn him. The whole issue here of de facto recognition was a disaster. Many secretaries of state subsequent to Bryan tried to change it. And they were able to change it for a few years, but then another crisis would come along and they would slide back to de jure recognition again. Bringing us up closer to the present and getting toward Vietnam. In 1946, James Burns, who was Truman's Secretary of State, announced publicly that we would return to a de facto policy of recognition. 3 years later, Chiang Kai-shek was driven to Formosa by Mao Zedong. The State Department, then with Dean Acheson as Secretary of State, sent a memo to all of our diplomatic offices abroad saying that we would be recognizing the new government in Beijing shortly. It was Peking then, Beijing shortly, and supporting its application for United Nations membership. That didn't happen till 1979. This was in 1949, 30 years later. Why not? What happened? Well, what happened was that Jacob Malik, the Soviet ambassador to the UN, called a meeting of the Security Council and belligerently demanded that the new Chinese government must be seated, and he threatened to walk out of the UN if it wasn't. The Cold War ambience, which was going at that time, could not stand the idea that the US could be soft on communism. And so when Malik made that belligerent demand, we immediately backed off. No, we're not going to support recognition. And we just swung enough votes with us to defeat the resolution for UN admission, which was just what the Soviets wanted. And here again is where we have erred in not being aware of our history. De facto policy was scrapped again. The 1950 book War or Peace by John Foster Dulles advocated a return to the de facto policy. 3 years later, he became Secretary of State and took the opposite position. What did we miss? The Sino-Soviet rift had been going strong for many years, and we just didn't recognize it. The era of Joe McCarthy and Jenner and Richard Nixon among them, what would be called the political right wing today, I don't know whether you call it that then or not, could not abide the idea of communism. So if you were communist, you were bad. If you weren't, you were good. And that rift was not recognized because we saw communism as a monolithic, Soviet-controlled monolithic. China was just part of it. But China and Russia were not getting along at all. They hadn't for years. Stalin in 1945 said there was nothing more dangerous to the Soviet Union than expansionist China. There had been years of territorial border fighting along the Chinese-Soviet border in Asia. The Soviets wanted China to have to depend on them for their international relations. They did not want China as a separate body in the United Nations because they couldn't keep them under their thumb that way. And later, although this was not at this time, a little later after Stalin's death in 1953, this rift continued because China saw Mao as the obvious inheritor of the mantle of communist leadership in the world. And the Russians were not, or the Soviets were not about to permit that to happen. In 1954, Molotov spoke of the Yellow Peril. In 1967, a Pravda editorial actually called for the overthrow of Mao Zedong. But through all of this, the United States took a monolithic view of international communism. The roots of that historic blunder of the Cold War era were that we saw the enemy as an ideology instead of Soviet aggression, imperialism. And here's where Senators McCarthy and Jenner and Representative Nixon, who was on the House Un-American Activities Committee, I don't know whether any of you remember Nixon's campaigns that got him into the House of Representatives. In 1964, he ran against Jerry Voorhees, and he smeared Voorhees in the campaign because Voorhees was supported by labor, and Nixon was announcing to the California people that labor unions were communist front organizations, and Jerry Voorhees couldn't be trusted in the House of Representatives because he was a communist sympathizer. In 1950, 4 years later, he ran another smear campaign against Helen Gahagan Douglas, whom he described in campaign speeches as pink right down to her underwear. Helen Hagen Douglas incidentally coined the phrase tricky dick. It was Nixon also who prosecuted the Alger Hiss case. And that conviction is still very controversial. Looking at that attitude about communism, I went into Google and typed in the phrase godless atheistic communism. 499 references to it. 499. I don't know who originated it. Google never told me. I tried to find out. I remember Eisenhower using that phrase in one of his speeches. And it was Eisenhower also who, responding to a reporter's question in 1954, said this: finally, you have broader considerations that might follow what you would call the falling domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up, you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go over very quickly. So you have the beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influences. End of quote. Specific description of the situation and conditions within Southeast Asia at the time, he did not specifically suggest a domino theory as a generalized theory. He simply applied it to one instance. But others picked it up, and very quickly the domino theory was born. It's still debatable. In my opinion, it's largely a discredited theory. Certainly other nations in Southeast Asia didn't fall when Vietnam finally did, but anyway, that's the domino theory. That's the historical context in which Vietnam arose. And incidentally, all of this is stuff that Robert McNamara said, we didn't know. At the time, we didn't know. Over and over again, he said that in his book afterwards, looking back with regret on what had happened. French Indochina, now consisting of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, was under the control of China for more than 1,000 years, following that under the control of France for 80 years, and under control of Japan during the Second World War. France could not defend it, and we said it was not strategic and that it should be surrendered to the Japanese, which raised an interesting question when we talked so much about, in Vietnam, about, quote, self-determination. Well, this was certainly not self-determination to say, well, Vietnam isn't important, let the Japanese take it. In all that period of time, of more than 1,000 years, there were only a few brief moments of self-rule, and they were all monarchical. There were no democratic movements at all. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan surrendered. The same day, Ho Chi Minh read the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. And in that he said, we hold the truths that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That immortal statement, of course, is extracted from our Declaration of Independence. These are undeniable truths, is what he said. The first independent, non-monarchical government in more than 1,000 years was raised in Vietnam. The elections gave Vietnam a clear majority, the Viet Minh a clear majority in the assembly. And, I'm sorry, I missed the point here. Gave a majority in the assembly. Ho Chi Minh was a communist, yes, but he was much more of a nationalist than a communist. What he wanted, after more than 1,000 years, was Vietnam having its own government. And that's all he wanted. He had no imperial designs on anybody. He objected because the French wanted to come back in and recolonize the place after the Second World War. Ellen Hammer, in her book A Struggle for Indochina, published in 1954, wrote this: American political stock had been high in Hanoi in 1945, when the name of the United States evoked associations with the Declaration of Independence, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and the Atlantic Charter. And American OSS agents had not hidden their sympathy for Vietnamese aspirations. But the United States, it soon became clear, would do nothing to aid the Viet Minh. By the way, it was the OSS that gave Ho Chi Minh a copy of the Declaration of Independence. In 1945, France moved. They sent 30,000 troops in. They occupied Saigon. They reasserted their colonial power and installed Bao Dai as a puppet emperor. Puppet ruler. He had been an emperor at one time. In 1950 to 54, the United States supported 80% of the costs, the economic costs, of the French war against the Viet Minh. But Eisenhower said he was convinced, that's a quote, convinced that the French could not win the war because the internal political situation in Vietnam, weak and confused, badly weakened by their military power. Eisenhower said, I have never talked or corresponded with a person knowledgeable in Indo-Chinese affairs who did not agree that had elections been held at the time of the fighting, probably 80% of the populace would have voted for the communist Ho Chi Minh as their leader, rather than the chief of state Bao Dai that had been imposed on them by the French. So much for U.S. support of self-determination. The war went on. In 1954, the French were decisively defeated at Dien Bien Phu, and the Geneva Accords were drawn up between France and the Viet Minh, which ended the war, temporarily divided Vietnam into North and South, and called for elections in 1956, 2 years later, to end the division. The U.S. supported the Accords. We were not a party to them. They were signed only by the Viet Minh and the French. But we said we would support them and would view very negatively any violation of them. Meanwhile, Diem had succeeded Bao Dai in the south, who had been put in there by the French and kept there by the U.S. He totally opposed the Geneva Accords, including the election. The United States, contrary to what it had promised, supported him, and the war became ours. And we'll get back to that a little bit later on the intelligence question with Vietnam and Lyndon Johnson. So let's turn now to the abuse of the intelligence. And here we're talking about both Vietnam and Iraq, or in the Middle East. The other night I said that it seemed to me rather obvious that the idea of intelligence would be to get the best, accurate, policy-neutral, vetted intelligence and base your policy on it. Vietnam and Iraq, we did exactly the opposite. The policy decisions were made, and then the intelligence was found, spun, invented, etc. to support it. We're like the village idiot who went around town with his gun shooting holes in the board fences and then drew targets around all the holes and claimed he was an excellent marksman. That's exactly what we did in Vietnam. LBJ detailed the plan for escalation when he came into office almost immediately after Kennedy's assassination. long before the Gulf of Tonkin occurred. Although the Gulf of Tonkin became the excuse. That's why we have to go into Vietnam to attack, that we were attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. Johnson's detailed plan had specific targets. It even has in it a text of a resolution to present to Congress to authorize this. And Tonkin in 1964 was the excuse he was waiting for. Somebody, I don't know whether Johnson personally did this, but in his administration, that was the thing that gave them the excuse to do what they wanted to do anyway. Tonkin took place in August of 1964. On August 2nd, there was a minor skirmish between North Vietnam patrol boats and the USS Maddox. There were no casualties, one bullet, not even a mortar, a missile, or a torpedo, just a bullet from a gun hit the USS Maddox. No casualties. 2 days later, on August 4th, Captain Herrick of the Maddox wired that they were under major attack. An hour later, 1 hour, he wired, quote, "Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Freak weather effects on radar and overeager sonar men may have accounted for many reports. No actual visual sightings by Maddox. Suggest complete evaluation before any further action taken." Another hour passed, and another wire came through from Captain Herrick. "Entire action leaves many doubts except for apparent ambush at beginning. Suggest thorough reconnaissance in daylight by aircraft." Then another wire. "The first boat to close the Maddox probably fired a torpedo at the Maddox, which was heard but not seen. All subsequent Maddox torpedo reports are doubtful. In that it is suspected that sonar man was hearing the ship's own propeller beat. We did send up reconnaissance planes. Squadron Commander James Stockdale was flying one of those planes overhead during the alleged attack. In a 1984 book, Love and War, he wrote, "I had the best seat in the house to watch the event, and our destroyers were just shooting at phantom targets. There were no PT boats there. There was nothing there but black water and American firepower." He also said that he had been cautioned by his superiors not to report that fact. 3 days later, based on the Tonkin attack, Congress passed a joint resolution which granted President Johnson the authority to conduct military operations in Southeast Asia without benefit of a declaration of war. Did LBJ lie, or was he only misled? I don't know. But I do know that just a few days after the incident, Johnson made a comment privately, quote, "For all I know, our Navy was shooting at whales out there. Draw your own conclusions." Some years later, in 1981, Captain Herrick and journalist Robert Scheer examined Herrick's ship log and determined, and they both agreed to this, the captain and the journalist, that the first August 4th torpedo report, which Herrick had maintained had occurred, that is, the apparent ambush, was in fact unfounded. In the fall of 1999, retired senior CIA executive Eugene Poteet wrote that he was asked early in August 1964 to determine if the radar operator's report showed a real torpedo boat attack or an imagined one. In the end, he concluded that there were no torpedo boats on the night in question, but that the White House was interested only in confirmation of an attack, not information that there was no attack. In 2000, Robert Hunyok, a historian for the U.S. National Security Agency, concluded that the NSA, National Security Agency, deliberately distorted, this is quote again, deliberately distorted the intelligence reports that it had passed on to policymakers regarding the August 4th incident. Only information that supported the claim, he said, that the communists had attacked the two destroyers was given to Johnson administration officials. Moving on to Iraq. In Iraq, the neocons were very disappointed and very angry with the first President Bush when in the first Gulf War, driving Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, we did not go on to Baghdad and topple the government and oust Saddam Hussein. They had been advocating this for years, and they were unhappy that he did that. There were a host of government organizations and think tanks that were behind this drive to oust Saddam Hussein. Project for the New American Century, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, the Center for Security Policy, the Hudson Institute, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research, plus government organizations such as the Defense Policy Board Advisory Committee, chaired by Richard Perrin. The interesting thing is when you look at these various organizations, both government and non-government, same names keep occurring repeatedly over and over and over again. So that these many organizations represent the same people all the time. Now, if you have doubts about their intent, look at the handouts that I gave you. The one on the top is from one of those think tanks on the political right, the Project for a New American Century. Note, it's a letter to President Clinton, written in January of 1998. Remember that it was 91 in September when the attack in Washington came, when the buildings were crashed into by airplanes. This letter is a strong advocacy of that we should go into Iraq militarily and otherwise and overturn Saddam Hussein. Not because of 9/11, and 9/11 was almost 4 years away, but they wanted to turn it over. You'll see a sentence at the end of, near the end of the first paragraph. That strategy should aim above all at the removal of Saddam Hussein's regime from power. And on the other side, at the bottom of the second paragraph, in the long term, it means removing Saddam Hussein and his regime from power. That now needs to become the aim of American foreign policy. And a little further down in the next paragraph, this will require a full complement of diplomatic, political, and military efforts. And look at the signatures at the bottom. William Crystal, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, James Woolsey, John Bolton, Richard Armitage, William Bennett, just to quote, list a few. And again, these are the names that turn up again and again and again in these various organizations. Clearly, the overturning of Saddam, the attack on Iraq was not, never was, based on the 9/11 attacks in New York City. There were three major groups One was the Defense Policy Board Advisory Committee that I mentioned a moment ago, chaired by Richard Pearl. Another was the project of the New American Century. And another, the most interesting one of all, is perhaps the Wolfowitz Cabal. And that's what it's called, Wolfowitz Cabal. Operating on a clash of civilizations theory developed by Zbigniew Brzezinski. This theory of Brzezinski's was that the clash of civilizations between the two sides was the point at issue. Essentially, religion was at the point of the issue. And that was what was the reason we had to act in Iraq. The Defense Policy Board met in September of 2001, the 19th and the 20th. They discussed the policy. Interesting, they also discussed how they could manipulate information to pin the 9/11 attacks on Saddam Hussein. They wrote a September 20th letter to President Bush, the day the conference ended. In it they said, but even if evidence does not link Iraq directly to the attack, any strategy aiming at the eradication of terrorism and its sponsors must include a determined effort to remove Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq. The United States, they continued, must therefore provide full military and financial support to the Iraqi opposition. American military force should be used to provide a safe zone in Iraq from which the opposition can operate. And American forces must be prepared to back up our commitment to the Iraqis' opposition by all necessary means. 2 days later, on September 22nd, and this I find fascinating, President Bush rejected the Policy Board's recommendation to declare war against Iraq. But the Wolfowitz Cabal and other neocons, to them, Bush's decision didn't really matter, and they continued their activity. They planted propaganda stories, they falsified reports of U.S. policy, they put out unapproved statements by members of the cabal. Interviews misrepresenting U.S. policy were planted around the globe, and intelligence reports were altered or manufactured to make them fit their policy goals. They even added a sentence to a letter from John Negroponte. And Colin Powell he didn't know what was happening. He wasn't told. He was left out of the loop. And he hit the ceiling when he found out what they had done. But again, the neocons, Wolfowitz, Pearl, etc., put policy first and then intelligence. Exactly the same thing that had happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. Policy, we want to attack Vietnam, we'll take an incident, we'll warp it, twist it, lie about it, have the excuse of the attack. Exactly the same thing was done here. Look at what happened. The Niger uranium, and the aluminum tubes, you remember those. Both documents supporting that were forgeries. Seymour Hersh, in New Yorker magazine, wrote, the IAEA has concluded, with the concurrence of outside experts, that these documents are not, in fact, authentic. El-Baradei said one senior IAEA official went even further. He told me the documents are so bad that I cannot imagine that they came from a serious intelligence agency. One of the letters was signed with the name of I don't know how do you pronounce that, Alain Hababou, a Niger minister of foreign affairs who had been out of office since 1989. Another allegedly from Tanja Mamadou, the president of Niger. Niger had a signature that had obviously been faked, and a text with inaccuracies so egregious the senior IAEA official said they could be spotted by someone using Google on the internet. One after another, intelligence reports doubted or discredited the authenticity of these documents regarding the uranium from Niger and the aluminum tubes. Yet even after the false statements, after that, the false statements continued to be made. Who did the forgeries? I don't know. I could not find. As far as I know, they're still publicly unknown. But it's a clear case of unvetted, unexamined, untested intelligence rumor being used because it supported a policy decision that had already been made. Now, what I've been talking about here is the tip of the iceberg. Tonkin in Vietnam, uranium and aluminum tubes, big in Iraq, big ones. But abuse of intelligence was also documented on numerous lesser cases. Funny when I was enjoyed, because he's one of my favorite characters to dislike in the Bush administration, is Douglas Feith. Douglas Feith was the Undersecretary of Defense Policy from 2001 to 2005. And his committee, whatever you call it, was assigned an intelligence agent. But Feith posted a guard, literally, this is Seymour Hersh reporting now, posted a guard outside the door to the room where the meeting was being held. And the guard stopped the intelligence agent from going into the room. And Feith told him, we already have our own intelligence who will tell us what we want to hear. We don't want you in here. That's what's happened again and again. I conclude with a comment where I'm really out of my element, and I'm sorry, I'd hoped that Dave Higgins, who's an FBI agent in our congregation, would be able to be here tonight. He was going to try to get here. My thoughts about what we need to do on this intelligence thing, but take these with a grain of salt, because I don't understand all this government infrastructure. I see the bigger picture, but I don't see the details. But I see two things that seem obvious to me. One is the principle that intelligence be as accurate as possible, not slanted to fit policy. You want factual information. You don't want to go out and look for information that supports what you want to do and avoid the information that doesn't. That's putting your head in the sand. But second, and this may be more controversial, I believe that intelligence information, the people that gather at that should be doing nothing but gathering intelligence, period, information. Totally separated from making policy, totally separated from execution of policy or any covert activity. In other words, the CIA should not be gathering intelligence, but also setting up secret prisons to inter people in. You know, this puts the prosecution and the judge and the jury and the whole thing all into one person or one agency. And I believe that those ought to be separated because the intelligence has to be independent of the administration's policies. And therefore, I would love to see us pull that back so that intelligence agents are doing nothing but gathering intelligence, passing it on to government, and they do with it then what they will. Okay, comments, questions, and again, particularly for those of you who weren't here, because of my hearing problem, this little gadget is an FM receiver with a microphone built into it that I can hear your question. Please speak up loudly, however, so don't speak softly just because you have this, because other people need to hear also. And so we'll turn this on and off we go. Okay, when you speak into it, turn it with the little bead on the end toward your mouth. Not up, not sideways, not down, not away from you. Turn that toward your mouth. Okay, comments, observations, questions? Pass that back, Ron. And speak loudly so everybody can hear.
Yeah, I just had a question, a factual question about the Tonkin case. Where the one, you said there was one bullet. So what was the one bullet? Where was that coming from?
They don't know. It was hit with one bullet. There apparently was a minor skirmish, and the critics have not suggested that there was not. There was a debate about whether the Maddox was in Vietnamese territorial water. There was a debate as to what the territorial limit was in the water, but nobody was denying that there was a minor incident. But there were no evidence of any torpedoes or anything, just a single shot. Yeah. Behind you.
For all we know, that could have been a careless coup.
I'm interested in this whole thing, which took place early in the present Bush administration, of the Department of Defense having its own, deciding that they were going to have their own intelligence.
Yes.
And I don't know what kind of approval, or do you have to get permission, or, I mean, how could this have been? How could this have happened?
The way it could have happened was that the Department of Defense, and they were not the only ones. There were, I believe, when this whole debate came up recently, there were some 17 different intelligence agencies operating. The Department of Defense simply said, hey, we're on the ground military out there. We've got to collect information out there. And we need our own people gathering it, not depending on some CIA person somewhere else. We need our own intelligence people. And they just developed it. There's no legal establishment of a Department of Intelligence. It just happened as a development within the DOD.
Well, it sounds like the story that you told at the end about Mr. Fife's meeting, that this is what that's who the intelligence person was. It was the Department of Defense intelligence agency that was in the room, and not the CIA.
Exactly.
Our beloved CIA.
Exactly. They blocked the CIA person from coming in. Yeah.
Well, this issue of all of a sudden the Defense Department having an intelligence activity is kind of strange, isn't it? I think I heard some time ago that military intelligence expenditures are 4 times greater than the CIA expenditures. And it's been that way for a long while. So,
yeah. It has, and I don't know when that started. I don't think it started with any big public announcement. It was just something that administratively was done within the Defense Department. But as I say, also other departments as well.
I think it was certainly well developed in the 80s, and I wouldn't be surprised when it existed in the 60s.
Yes. I'm inclined to agree with you. I can't document that, but I think you're probably right. Over on your...
It seems to me that you're also kind of in the history that the foreign policy of our country seems to have been dominated by what I would consider conservative, authoritarian forces. And the question is, what is the origin of this? That it goes back in history that our foreign policy seems much more conservative than our national policy, for example. And how does one get to the root of this so that our foreign policy reflects more what America really feels and wants rather than the dictates of the dominance of certain people within foreign policy?
Well, I think the problem, could you all hear the question? Yeah, okay. I think the problem here was that the fear tactics, of course, were used. You know, the weapons of mass destruction, they turn into a mushroom cloud, and, you know, we got to stop them over there, we'll have to stop them over here, all of that. But that goes back a long way. And the whole notion of, that I referred to at the beginning of tonight's lecture, from McCarthy and Jenner and the anti-communist hysteria of that era, which finally got so bad that the Senate clamped down on McCarthy at least, but the development of the fear tactic and the propaganda, that again, these neocons in this era of the Middle East were just planting stories, inaccurate stories all over the place to develop that fear. And the uranium from Niger and the aluminum tubes were two big ones, but there were little ones everywhere. And it was a conservative, aggressive policy that took the position that U.S. needed, was what Wolfowitz and his Wolfowitz cabal called the battle of civilizations. And it was a sense that the world is either us or them. And if we don't stop them, we're out. And that kind of mentality was used as a fear tactic, and this whole thing just grew and grew and grew. And by attributing it to an ideology in Vietnam, in Southeast Asia, attributing it to communism, in the Middle East, attributing it to radical Islam, you have a visible enemy out there that you target, and they have to be exterminated. Kill off the communists, kill off the radical Muslims. You know, we cheer when the report says we killed a Muslim leader. That just goes on and on and on. And it snowballs, it develops, it feeds on itself. But the fact that the same names of the same neocons, the ones on the bottom of that letter plus some others, keep appearing in the organizations. There's a whole batch of organizations here. And you're going to Billy Crystal and Rupert Murdoch and this kind of thing are all part of that.
I heard one account that suggested that the Tonkin Gulf resolution was actually written well in advance of the actual incident. Have you seen any indication of that?
Yes, it was. The planning group drew up the detailed plan for the invasion of Vietnam, for the escalation. When Kennedy died, we had about 16,000 troops in Vietnam. And they were doing some fighting, but they were allegedly mainly there as support and, quote, advisors to the South Vietnamese government. The detailed plan that was developed, that went into effect after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, was developed before, and it included the wording for the congressional resolution to get Congress to support when the time came. Yeah, there's a document copy of that. It's available.
At what point, if ever, will the Democratic candidate be able to bring out some of this truth? I mean, we're talking about being there 100 years and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So at some point,
Well,
I think the
and-
public deserves to hear much
Yeah.
more about the truth.
Wolfowitz and company, the Wolfowitz cabal, had said 30 years, way back before we ever attacked. Yeah, but part of the problem here is that in the political climate, this whole atmosphere of fear is there. Go back to the question of de facto and de jure recognition and listen to what Clinton says and what Obama says about Iran. Hillary says, no, we won't talk to Iran except under certain conditions. And the conditions that she set up are the conditions that need to be arbitrated in discussion. So if you'll do what we want you to do, we'll talk to you. This whole notion that you don't talk to the enemy is the person you most need to talk to. And it makes no sense. I mean, thank God for Richard Nixon in China. He had this at least enough to go to China and break down that 30-year barrier against talking to China because it was communist. But more often than not, that never happens. I mean, you know, I don't know whether Obama, if he became president, would be able to get negotiations or talk at least to Iran. But at least he's saying, yes, I would try to do that. And Hillary's saying, not unless the conditions are met. You know, we are still subject to the fear tactics that just go rolling on continually in the news. We are under threat. And you get it. It's become, I think, I fear, an American mentality. You see it on the street gangs. I mean, you see it in our cities. You see the other people are out to get me, and I got to fight them. And you see it certainly in the corporate world. So it's much broader than international, but it's all of the above. Further comments? You talked out?
Very good series.
Okay, well. Thank you much.